Great. Well, thanks so much for being here for our event on marine sound and impacts to marine species and subsistence. I'm really thrilled to see so many people here participating today. The event is co-hosted by our Marine Ecosystems Collaboration Team and the Arctic Observing Team. And it represents one in a series that we began earlier this year on opportunities to better design monitoring and modeling initiatives that are focused on basic science to also meet applied science needs. And when we introduced this series earlier this year, we talked about how individuals in resource management agencies, academic scientists, and Alaska community members all have very different needs for information and all need that information on different timescales. And that can pose some challenges to cooperation. But IARPC Collaborations is well placed to interact with people in each of these three spheres. And so we hope that we can serve a role in facilitating communication among individuals so we can help you to identify opportunities to work together better and inspire action. And our Marine Ecosystems team hosted a presentation on June 23rd about a new BOEM Center of Excellence for Marine Acoustics. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that presentation by Erica Satterman, I really encourage you to do so. It provides a really nice introduction to the complexities of the issues of marine sound and what BOEM is trying to do at a national level to address it. But today we'd really like to focus our conversation more on issues specific to Alaska, recognizing that Alaska is experiencing less sea ice and longer periods of open water, which is increasing marine traffic in Alaska waters. And vessel noise may disturb marine life and cause animals to shift their distributions and cause them to move away from traditional harvest areas. And subsistence hunters are experiencing dangerous conditions as they travel farther to harvest resources for their communities. And this is really creating some important concerns with respect to food security for people living in the Arctic. And so we'd like to take this opportunity to focus our conversation on what we could do to work better to help address that issue in Alaska. So what we're going to do today is experiment with a different format, and we're going to break out into small breakout groups. And we hope that each of the breakout groups will include individuals from Alaska communities, resource management agencies, and academic scientists. And I'm thrilled that we've got some experts in marine acoustics specifically joining us today that can contribute to the conversation. And we hope that you'll focus your discussions on what are our opportunities for better cooperation to address this issue and how could we achieve them. So for example, what are the needs in terms of scientific data collection? Do we need more data that's collected in nearshore areas that would be more relevant potentially to subsistence harvest? And what are the real challenges associated with collecting those types of data? And how could people and communities maybe cooperate with marine acoustic experts to collect the sort of data that we'd need to address this issue? And we hope that by breaking out into smaller groups, it'll allow greater opportunity for everybody's voice to be heard, so you can all share your great ideas and have an opportunity to really develop some relationships with individuals and other spheres at a more personal level. And because we'll be in different breakout groups, we hope that each group will identify somebody to volunteer to share the ideas that come out of your discussion with everyone when we come back to plenary. And we hope to come back with about 25 minutes left so that we can have a chance for each group to report on some of the great things that came out of your conversation. And we're also just interested in hearing whether this small breakout room format is effective. So as we prepare to shift into our breakout group discussions, we'd like to ask you to rename yourself in Zoom by placing a 1, a 2, or a 3 before your name to identify yourself as either a member of an Alaska community, an academic scientist, or a member of an agency or funding organization. And we realize that everyone may not necessarily fit neatly into one of those 3 boxes, but please just choose whichever of the 3 you feel best represents you for the purposes of our conversation today. And folks on the phone don't need to worry about renaming yourself. We'll make sure that you get to a breakout room. If you're not familiar with how to rename yourself in Zoom, you should be able to click on the participants icon in your window and hover over your name. And if you click more, it should give you the option to rename yourself, so you can add that number to your name. So as you're all renaming yourselves, and as our secretariat is working on setting up those breakout rooms, I'd just like to put those questions for discussion back up on the screen for you to begin thinking about them. And when you get to your breakout room, I'd like to ask you to please begin by briefly introducing yourself and answer the icebreaker question, what is your favorite sound? So again, please bear in mind that everyone who's joined us today recognizes the importance of this issue and is interested in thinking about what role they might play in helping us to better address it and how they could cooperate. And we hope that these small breakout rooms will give you an opportunity to meet folks in other spheres and develop some relationships and talk about your ideas for how we might work together to achieve these ideas. And as you come up with these good ideas for what's needed and how you might address it, one of the things we'd like you to think about is how we could achieve them. And so we're looking at identifying instances where there's a will, but not a way. So maybe there's people who are willing to cooperate, they have some good ideas for what needs to be done, but there are some barriers in terms of funding or something else. And so thinking about the how we could achieve them will help those of us from funding organizations and management agencies think about what we might do to help address the how as we plan for future research. So with that, I will check in with Drew and Liz and see if we are ready to move into our breakout rooms. Might take them a minute.
Thank you, Liz. I'll pass over to Danielle in a second. I'll just say thank you, everyone. I know our group had a really great set of conversations. So Danielle, is there a particular way that you want to kind of introduce the next 25 minutes?
Thanks. No, I think what I might do is just ask for a volunteer from each breakout group to please share some of the big picture ideas and highlights that came out of your conversation, bearing in mind that we only have until 11:30. Liz, how many breakout rooms do we have?
We had 6.
Great. Okay. Can you maybe help us figure out, who, or I don't know if maybe we want to go around and have each breakout group kind of volunteer as someone. I don't know how we identify who was in which group.
Yeah, I can let you know which secretariat member was where, if
Perfect.
that would be helpful.
That would be
so
great. Thanks.
Room 1 had Drew. Room 2, Danielle, I was counting you as a secretariat member. Okay. Group 3 did not have a secretariat member, so hopefully someone was taking notes in there. Room 4 had Sarah. Room 5 had Meredith, and room 6 had Hazel.
Great. So maybe I'll let Drew identify somebody who'll report out for their room 1 breakout group first. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. I think we ran out of time to identify someone, so I will start off, but I'm going to invite my group to please feel free to cut me off or butt in if they have anything they'd like to add. So yeah, some of the things we talked about were, it's kind of a two-pronged problem. First is, the issue of understanding of just kind of the data side, or just understanding the problem of sound. So, whether it's collecting data, trying to figure out, what is the most relevant information that can be gathered both for scientists and community members. And so that's one side of the coin. So understanding and modeling and predicting that kind of thing. And the second side is trying to avoid or eliminate sound in the Arctic. And so, that's a whole range of efforts that include, engineering levels. So one thing we discussed was how, as an engineering challenge to reduce sound from, cargo ships, but also it's a, management and kind of a political issue. So both the, where large ships are both in space and time, but also their frequency and and also the issues with, international sounds. One thing we discussed was the issues of, at least in the Bering Sea, it's not only US vessels, but it's also other nations that are kind of traversing that strait. So also having to kind of deal with that, how do you mitigate that kind of sound? And then kind of the last sorts of things we're talking about is how can we better kind of gather anecdotal stories and evidence that are beyond, specific campaigns, and just trying to, democratize, I guess, how we collect information about sound and making that useful for not just scientists, but for community members as well. So that's a very quick readout. If there's anyone else from my group would like to add anything, I invite them to do so. If not, maybe we'll pass it on.
Okay, Liz, did you say that I was in group 2?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. Well, we had a really interesting discussion, and so it'll be a challenge to summarize what came out of it. So I invite everyone who's still on the line from my group to please add once I do my best here. We were really fortunate to have Billy Adams from Jagvik in our group, as well as Kate Stafford, and the two of them have collaborated together on issues like this before. And so it was really wonderful to be able to join a conversation with the two of them and hear about what they think the important issues are. It was really interesting to hear Billy talk about how what's really important from his perspective is the timing of use of certain areas for various species of marine mammals, for example, and for subsistence hunters. So animals that are migratory will pass through. And so looking at what are those important areas, when would be really important, and focusing some monitoring then. He also talked about how it's not only anthropogenic noise like ship traffic and seismic, but also the relatively new influences of other marine species that are frequenting the Arctic now, like humpback whales and other subarctic species, and especially killer whales. And wanting some more research about, how vocalizing killer whales may cause other whales like bowhead whales to fall silent, and what kind of effect that may have as well. So I thought that was a really interesting question to pass on to some of our acoustic experts. One of the most important things that came out of our conversation was that meeting in person in communities is still really critically important. And so Billy's really looking forward to a time when scientists can come back to communities and talk with folks like him in person and build those relationships that can then lead to better cooperation and collaboration. And so he noted that every community has different areas that they know are important for different species. So for example, areas like Barrow Canyon and Smith Bay are really important near Kuyavik for bowhead whales. And that will really depend on things like changes in wind direction. And so talking with people on the ground about what they know and what the important questions are with respect to each species and each community is really important. And so it'll be really important to have those conversations in person at the first opportunity. But in the meantime, Billy mentioned that things like mailing flyers still work to get information out. The mail's still delivered every day in Utqiagvik. And so if you're trying to reach out to community members and share opportunities or to talk about collaborating with science, that's still a good way to get information out there. And the radio too reaches just about everybody in rural communities. And so he mentioned that that would also be a good way until we can meet again in person to communicate. So I'll stop there, and I'll invite other members of our group to add anything I may have missed. Thanks.
I think you did a great job of summarizing that, Danielle. Thank you.
Thanks. So Liz, who was our Secretariat member in group 3?
So we didn't
I
have a
wasn't one.
secretariat member, but I think that Olivia said,
Yeah, I'm reporting out for group 3.
Thank you.
Fortunately, most of what we discussed actually overlaps with what Drew and Danielle already said. I'll quote Will, this is our bottom line here, that we just need better communication. It seems too simple. But that's kind of where we ended up. We had a couple of people who work in the Norwegian and in the South Pacific on acoustic issues. And they also mentioned that in addition to having good communication, the ability to incorporate our Indigenous collaborators, not just in informal information sharing, but throughout the process of planning the research and implementing the research. And in any follow-up on policy setting is important because they need to be equal partners in any kind of acoustic monitoring efforts. There was discussion again about how important it is to not just know what kind of acoustic monitoring is going out there, but why? What's the inventory? But why do we also want to know about the kinds of acoustic impacts or issues that are going on? So we can better plan the research if we know why we want to be monitoring these issues. We did touch on issues of monitoring internationally and some of the challenges of trying to monitor and get access to acoustic impacts from the Russian side. And this was confirmed by a collaborator and our group member in Norway that it's also challenging for them to get some of the access to some of the maybe raw data. So potentially a way for better collaboration is to work with our international partners and just not getting the raw data, but maybe some subset of data that looks more specifically at the particular acoustic impact that you're interested in monitoring. We talked a little bit about the types of ongoing acoustic monitoring assets that we have. There's probably a lot of room for federal agencies to better coordinate and collaborate on who's doing monitoring. And there was an issue of how it is very challenging to create a sustained record for acoustic monitoring because they are supported on a grant by grant, research by research project basis. So ideally it would be great if there was a bit better coordination among the funding agencies to help support long-term observing for acoustic. And I'll let others in my group add.
Well, that was excellent, Olivier. Thanks, that was really good. The only other thing I would add was we did talk about the conflict avoidance agreements, which have been used to some success, largely between the oil and gas companies and natives hunting bowheads, and whether that is a model for other conflicts or not is something that we discussed and might be worth exploring. Yeah, but on that, you covered everything perfectly. Thanks.
So do we have someone from group 4 who's willing to report out?
Sarah, that would be your group. Great.
So my group talked a lot of similar points compared to the other groups as well. I'll just reiterate some of the things that we stressed a little more or some slightly different things. We talked a lot about how the whole Bering Sea and Bering Strait and Arctic are a really dynamic system in terms of you've got seasonal shipping traffic, you've got very migratory animals coming through, you have also regional differences in the sea ice coverage. You know, some places are covered most of the year, a solid chunk of the year, other places in the southern part aren't covered as much. And so taking all of those into account is really important. Also, when political boundaries matter versus sound transcending those political boundaries. So we talked about like the US-Russian side of the Bering Strait and how there's pretty dramatic differences in shipping traffic between Russia and the Russian side and the US side. And how those differences could impact noise, but that noise still propagates. We also reiterated other calls that people have made for the importance of some kind of boundary spanning organization. One thing that we really stressed in our conversation was the importance of centering Indigenous voices at the beginning. Co-production isn't co-production unless it involves Indigenous communities from the very beginning. And so one other thing we talked about was the potential of using like a food security lens as a wonderful way to shape perspectives and shape research questions and research agendas. I know the Inuit Circumpolar Council has done a lot of great work looking at food security, and Margaret brought them up as a great example of a successful way of gathering Indigenous representatives in workshops and things like that in a productive way. But in addition to Indigenous organizations, researchers, regulators, funding agencies, the Coast Guard, State Department, international community, tech companies, all of those stakeholders that are involved in vessel traffic could be brought to the table. We also talked about gaps in knowledge and what those research questions are that other people have kind of brought up about how the impacts of sound on particular species, we don't necessarily have great fine scale information on how they respond. We thought also engaging with Native organizations like the Eskimo Whaling Commission or the Eskimo Walrus Commission could be a good way to co-produce research questions and research approaches that can answer some of these knowledge or fill some of these knowledge gaps, as well as the role of Indigenous and traditional knowledge in identifying animal behavior and behavioral responses to vessel traffic, because there's limits to what research approaches in terms of like buoys or observations can do, but Indigenous people are the experts in animal behavior, hunters are, and so there's potential area there for overlap and collaboration. And I'll open that up if there's anyone in my group wants to add on to that.
Great job, Kelly. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Group 5, Liz, who was the?
That would be Meredith's group.
Okay, thanks. We also had a really good discussion that I'll just try to capture briefly. So we started out by kind of naming some of the related issues around sound. So climate change, on migration patterns, and shipping, as well as invasive species. One thing that was pointed out around infrastructure was that both the making of the ports as well as the ongoing activities around the potentially new infrastructure are happening on different timescales and would have different effects. And then we started getting into the question of how to collaborate. And there were several existing networks that were brought up, including the LEO network, AOK, and the Indigenous Sentinels network. And we had a conversation around those, the differences and overlap between those different networks. And that's brought us to a conversation on how to increase collaboration, and monetary compensation was part of that. And it was noted that there's are few easy mechanisms for transferring money from funding organizations to local community observers. And but one mechanism potentially is using subcontractors. That was one solution that was suggested. And then we also spent a lot of time talking about data sovereignty and the fact that when there are efforts to centralize data, it often requires Indigenous observers or just local communities to relinquish the power of their data. And so it was pointed out that bypassing regional networks should not be done. And there was a discussion around, if we want to have more collaboration, how do we develop mechanisms to do that and to share data and to provide compensation? And it was an initial first step was suggested an MOU that states compensation in data terms at the beginning, with the parties kind of put on, so everyone could put it on paper. And we also had a mention of an article that I'll put in the chat that was written by Vera Metcalf that speaks to some of these issues around collaboration, and I'll open it up to anyone else in the group to add to that.
Thanks so much, Meredith. That's all really great information. If no one else from Meredith's group wants to chime in, I guess we'll move to group 6.
Hazel, that's your group.
Yeah, Sierra, if you're ready, we were nominated
Sure.
Sierra to report back.
Well, and John is going to add in anything that I've missed, I certainly hope. So in the interest of time, I'll start with the end of where we got to. Right at the end, we were getting kind of excited, having talked about a lot of the things that I've already heard, with the idea of some kind of calendar map, what's happening both in terms of the species and the research activities or other noise activities, using that as a way of looking for duplication, helping communities to consider, is all of this really necessary? What's answering my questions? And providing a way then of tying in, there's some way to tie into all the different policy mechanisms that would mitigate impacts that were identified, and just giving people kind of a shared understanding, a way of looking at something all together and having a shared understanding. And some of the things that were mentioned leading up to that, right as we were getting to the end of the time, where recognition, there's some examples where, science that's been done and monitoring that's been done isn't necessarily getting conveyed as effectively as it might be to folks in communities, and then the amount of time and effort it takes for them to go through all this stuff, and questions about whether, as I mentioned, whether all the research that's been being done is what's needed or whether there are other gaps. There was, in general, the starting point was recognizing, well, we really miss in-person meetings and you get a lot of value. And there was a lot of interest from all the participants in having opportunities to collaborate and talking about the various format options that, and timings of conferences and whatnot with AEWC, et cetera, to do that. So it was a very nice conversation that otherwise touched on a lot of the things that have already been said. And I hope somebody from my group will add anything that I've missed.
No, I think you did a good job, Sierra. And basically, I can create a map that shows all our communities and when they're whaling as an example. But what we don't have is a map that shows all the research vessels and when they'll be out there. And that's what we were talking about, is creating a map and calendar all in one, in doing so. And also the reporting portion, when we get a report, I can grab a 200-page report from a research project, and I'll probably understand about 10% of it if I'm lucky. So actually having that report and having a summary in layman's terms of what that report really means would be really helpful as to how we can use it as well to our benefit as you use it to your benefit as well. I think that would be a huge plus in reporting back as to what that research really accomplished. If there's anything else, and I hope that helps, but if there's anything else, please add on.
Well, I'll add, if you don't mind, John, with one of the comments you made, which was, I loved if you talk to other hunters along the coast. Why can't researchers talk to other researchers and help to come together and do some coordination as well? Which isn't to say that doesn't happen, but I thought that was a great question that you posed.
I did too. And this is Kathy, and I think I'll just add on that we really had a really nice, robust conversation, and really thanks to John and Dawn and Catherine and everybody for joining in. But we talk about that there's a need for a next step, and that perhaps we could come together again in some sort of forum. John had mentioned, that AEWC was thinking of a 3-committee forum, but I'm just going to put it out there that having some sort of continued dialogue on this issue across research, government, hunters, and industry, to really take a hard look at what's been done, what are the pressing issues, and how can we go forward. So today was outstanding.
I'm so glad to hear that. It sounds like all of the groups had a really positive discussions and came up with some really good ideas. One of the questions I have is whether this is an effective format. And I would love to, to hear whether people like this small breakout group format. I think we all got to hear some great ideas when we came back to plenary. I think it went pretty well, but it'd be great to hear whether maybe whether other people thought that this was good. But I'll point out that on the IARPA Collaborations website, there's a page for this event where I hope you went to get to our agenda. And there's a comment box at the bottom of that website. And I don't know if it's easy for Drew or Liz or someone to bring up the page to show people what I'm talking about. But if you go to that comment box, anyone can add comments. And so we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your ideas. If you want to share information with folks about venues for meetings like the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission that are coming up, that you would love to have some of these experts in marine acoustics come and talk to you, please share that information, and everyone who joined us today should have access to that. And we'd love to keep the conversation going there. And please reach out to myself or Kathy Kuhn or Jackie Grebmeyer from the Marine Ecosystems Collaboration Team if you'd like to see us host another event to continue this discussion. IARPC also has a nice opportunity for self-forming groups. So if folks think that there's enough interest in the marine sound issue specifically, you could form a self-forming team to host continued dialogue on this topic specifically. So we're coming to the end of our time now.
Danielle.
Yes, go ahead, John.
So I was just going to comment on your question of, is this a great forum? I believe this is a great forum. It's working. But I will also always advocate for in-person meetings. And we talked about a little bit about this in our breakout, where you might even learn something during a coffee break that you might not hear in a meeting room or in a chat room. You might have lunch with somebody and get to know more about the issue at dinner time, or when you're just sitting there waiting for your shuttle, and so forth. But having an in-person meeting, I think, is more effective in the event that we can't because of what's happening in the world today. This might be the best form that we can come to until then, but the goal should always be to figure out a way to have an in-person meeting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I wholeheartedly agree. I want nothing more than to get back to talking with folks like you during coffee breaks and lunch hours. Absolutely. And I think we heard that from everyone.
Danielle, this is
Yes,
Rafaela.
Rafaela.
So in a way, you know, what's being discussed here really reminds me of, we used to have the open water meetings, right? Which unfortunately got abandoned many, many years ago. And it sounds like that this could be a really good step forward to fill that void again. It used to be, you know, industry, you know, mostly presenting their information at that time because of the, you know, resource extraction and development. But I think it's very opportune to have these meetings again with the different parties and, you know, discuss these issues. So just wanted to point out that kind of reminds me of open water meetings that were many, many years ago. Thanks.
Catherine Kim with Greenwich Sciences. That was brought up in our Group 6 meeting as well, because I recall the open water meetings in Anchorage that NOAA used to sponsor. And there are a variety of stakeholders there, and there's an opportunity to communicate your science as well as in person, get that in-person communication we just talked about. I don't know who would sponsor that now and organize all of that, but I always thought it was a valuable meeting.
Yes, I agree. I also attended those for many years and also felt they were a really useful forum. That brings us to our question about the how that we posed earlier is, you know, the funding. It takes money to host those meetings and to provide money and support for people to come to those meetings if they're not already funded by a project that would provide those funds. And I think it'd be good to have a conversation about what are the mechanisms for getting money together for something like that. And I would love to see that as an Indigenous-led effort so that folks who are most invested in the issue can control the dialogue too.
Danielle, I at one point in time I had a suggestion about how and the funding. Oftentimes you hear about a research project costing 1.2 million or $2 million. You know, if grant writers can add a little overhead say 1% or 2% of that grant from each research project and put into whoever's managing it as a group, an organization, a nonprofit, or something that's created to manage all of this, would use that funding to host those meetings as part of collaboration and cooperation, as a way of doing something. You either ask for a little more, 1% fee or 2% fee on top of that, or take out of that existing grant from the funders, whether they're private funders or government funding, would go towards that. That might solve some of the funding issues. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that idea, John. And I'm really glad you're sharing it in this forum in ARPIC, where we're reaching all of the relevant funding agencies that are active in the Arctic. Thank you for sharing that here. So with that,
Danielle.
Yes.
Danielle, so this Rafaela one more time. So I really like John's perspective on this, but I also think, for the funders, this has to be a long-term, effort. It's just like when NOAA invested in its, in its Arctic observatory system. This is about, that transformation that we're seeing right now and the changes that are occurring. It's not a Band-Aid where we, convene somebody once and say, oh, we're going to do this now for 2 years. I think it has to be the acknowledgement that if something like this is moved forward, is to understand, just like any other, ICC meeting, that these are the collaborators there to stay, right? These are the research partners. So ultimately, NOAA or any federal or private contributors need to think of it as this is something for the next 10, 15 years that needs to be looked at. It's not, even if we have an answer on certain things within 2 years, right? It's going to continue to evolve. So I think, like NPRB being such a long-term, institution, that's kind of the institutions we need to look for, to say, like John said, add 1%, where it's like the overall body of research that is taking place in the Arctic needs to support a platform to advance the knowledge and to be able to mitigate and to address threats. And I think, and I know, Danielle, you're involved with that as well. So just want to point this out. It's not about short-term solution. It is about the long game. And so therefore it cannot be, an NSF, one time off 5-year plan to do it. It's like, no, invest like you invest in a federal agency, or like the hunters invest in their own commissions. Thanks.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Rafaela. So I want to thank everyone for joining the conversation today, and I look forward to where we go from here to continue these conversations. I hope the breakout groups gave you the opportunity to develop some new relationships with new potential collaborators, and I hope you'll follow up with one another and continue your conversations going forward. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and bring this webinar event to a close. And before everyone signs off, I just want to provide an opportunity, as we do at the end of all of our meetings, for announcements from anyone who would like to share information about anything that may be relevant to the folks on the call today. And I'll begin by letting everyone know that North Pacific Research Board has recently announced a request for proposal and made $2.2 million available for an Arctic synthesis and an assessment that will provide NPRB input as we move towards a new integrated ecosystem research program that will be centered in the Northern Bering Sea. So I encourage you all to look at the website, www.nprb for North Pacific Research Board.org, and look at the Integrated Ecosystem Research Program page to find information about that solicitation. It has a deadline of December 15th. Would anyone else on the call like to share any announcements? And if not, I'll invite any of our other team leads to join me in making our closing remarks and thanking you all for spending the time with us today.
No, I would just echo, Danielle, what you said. Time is valuable, and all of this input was really interesting. So we appreciate everybody's time. And look forward to this format and other meetings in the future. And I would just commend anybody who is not a member of IARPIC. I hate to tell people to join organizations, but IARPIC has brought this meeting together, and we welcome everybody, federal employees and others, to join and participate. Thanks.
Danielle?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody here this morning. Still morning here. Thank you to everybody here this morning, and thank you for the invite and allowing us to participate and take part in this. I think this is a positive step forward in a working relationship that that can go beyond generations if we see fit, both with the research community and the subsistence users. Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission's next meeting is set for December 1 through the 4th, I believe, just for you guys' information. And they'll be held in Anchorage over at the Crown Plaza in person. But again, thank you to everybody, and thank you for the invite and allowing us to participate as AEWC.
Thank you very much for spending the time with us this morning, John.
All right, I'm gonna close the Zoom down. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.